I have an invite, but they left me outside, Annie whispered, clutching the card tightly in both hands, its edges already wrinkled. Richard Bennett stopped beside the girl. Why are you standing out here? He asked gently. If you have an invitation, you should be inside. The scholarship ceremony started a few minutes ago. The girl looked up at him. I came early, Annie said. I gave them my invitation at the check-in table. The security guard looked at it. But then he said my name was no longer on the list. He told me to wait outside until someone figured out the problem. Richard's eyes dropped to the ticket in her hand. You were here before the ceremony started. Yes, sir, and they still left you out here. Annie gave a small nod. I did exactly what my mother told me to do. She told me to show them my invitation and call her once I got inside. Richard turned his head toward the stage. Inside the hall, everything was bright, polished, and full of guests applauding a promise of opportunity and fairness. Then he looked back at the girl standing in the hallway, both hands holding tightly to that very promise. Is there something wrong with your invitation? He asked. Or do you think there may have been a mistake? Annie immediately handed it to him. My mother checked it 3 times. My name is on it, and so is the confirmation code. She said I was supposed to be first. Richard carefully took the invitation. At the top in bold blue letters, it read Official Invitation of the Bennett Future Scholarship Fund. Below it was the name Annie Brooks. Under her name were a confirmation number, a QR code, a seat number, and one line that changed Richard's expression. Scholarship recipient number 0001. Recipient number 1. Richard looked from the invitation to Annie. This invitation has everything it is supposed to have, he said. Your name, your confirmation code, your seat number. He turned the paper slightly and saw the blue seal near the bottom along with the printed signature he had personally approved. It even has my signature in the foundation seal. So why would a child with a valid invitation be refused entry? Annie pressed her lips together as if deciding whether she should say what she had heard. The security guard stopped me first, she said. Then a woman came over. She was holding a tablet and she had a small device in her ear. She told the security guard that another boy would be arriving soon. When he said his name, the guard was supposed to let him in instead of me. Richard went still. What boy? Annie looked toward the ballroom doors. She said his name was Tyler Grayson. For a moment, the applause from the hall seemed to fade away. Richard knew that name. Tyler Grayson was the son of David Grayson, a wealthy partner sitting inside the room. David Grayson did not need scholarship money. He could hire every top tutor in Georgia for his son without ever looking at the bill. Richard lowered the invitation slightly. What did you just say? Annie repeated clearly what she had heard. The woman said, when Tyler Grayson arrives, let him through. He'll take the open seat. Then she looked at my invitation and told the guard that my name had been removed from the list. Richard narrowed his eyes. She really said that? Annie nodded. I heard her clearly. Richard looked toward the guest check-in area. A security guard stood a few steps away, broad-shouldered with gray at his temples and one hand near the guest list. His name tag read, Marcus Hill. Richard held out one hand to Annie. May I borrow your invitation for a moment? Annie gave it to him. Richard walked straight toward the guard. Excuse me, Richard said. Marcus turned around, his expression professional, but tired. Sir, if you're looking for the guest check-in table, you just need to. Richard held up Annie's invitation. Why is this girl standing outside? Marcus looked at the invitation, then at Annie, then back at Richard. He still did not recognize him. Sir, I can't discuss event seating arrangements with guests. I'm not asking as a guest. Marcus frowned slightly. Richard's voice remained calm. I'm Richard Bennett. Marcus's posture changed at once. Mr. Bennett. Sir, I'm sorry. I didn't recognize you. I asked why Annie Brooks is being kept outside. Marcus looked uncomfortable. Sir, I was following the updated list. She has an official invitation. Yes, sir. I saw that she has confirmation from the foundation. Yes, sir. She has my signature. Marcus swallowed. Yes, sir. And her name is listed as scholarship recipient number 1. That's exactly why I found it strange, too, Marcus said. I didn't want to turn her away, but Miss Whitmore brought over an updated seating list. She said Annie Brooks had been removed because of a duplicate entry. A duplicate entry? Yes, sir. Richard looked down at the invitation. And what about Tyler Grayson? Marcus fell silent. Richard's voice lowered. Mr. Hill. Marcus let out a heavy breath. Miss Whitmore told me that when Tyler Grayson arrived, I was supposed to add him as scholarship recipient number 12. She said the change had already been approved. Approved by whom? She didn't say. Sir, did you see approval from me? No, sir. From the Scholarship Review Board? No, sir. Did anyone besides Clara Whitmore give you that instruction? Marcus lowered his head. No, sir. Behind them, the ballroom doors opened, sending a wave of applause into the hallway. Annie turned toward the sound, but did not step forward. She remained behind the invisible line where the adults had told her to wait. Richard looked at Annie, then back at Marcus. How long has she been standing here? About 40 minutes. 40 minutes. Richard repeated. Marcus's face tightened with shame. She didn't cause any trouble, sir. She only kept asking if we could check her name one more time. Richard took out his phone and scanned the QR code on Annie's invitation. The private event app opened immediately. A green confirmation notice appeared on the screen. Valid Annie Brooks Scholarship recipient number 001. He turned the phone so Marcus could see it. Then he turned the screen toward Annie. Your invitation is valid, Richard said. Annie gave a small nod as if she had been waiting for the room to finally admit what she had known from the beginning. That's what I told them. Richard looked at the invitation in his hand and pointed to the confirmation line. And you were right. Before Annie could answer, a woman's voice sounded in the hallway. Mr. Bennett, there you are. Clara Whitmore hurried toward them in a cream-colored suit, a tablet tucked under one arm, the earpiece beside her cheek still glowing faint blue. The smile on her face was well practiced, but it faltered the moment she saw Annie standing beside Richard. We need you inside, Clara said. The program is continuing. Richard did not move. Why was Annie Brooks removed from my scholarship list? Clara glanced at Marcus, then at Annie, then back at Richard. It was only a seating adjustment, she said. A minor procedural issue. Richard looked straight into her eyes. A child with a valid invitation was left outside in the hallway for 40 minutes. We can handle this after the ceremony. No, Richard said, we are handling it right now. Inside the ballroom, the host had just announced that the 12th scholarship would be awarded in a moment. Out in the hallway, Richard Bennett stood between the closed doors and the girl his own foundation had nearly erased from the list. In his hand was a truth too clear to be called a misunderstanding. Annie Brooks had not arrived late. She had not lost her way and she had not misunderstood anything. Her name had been replaced. Annie stepped closer to where Richard was standing. Clara Whitmore managed to keep the smile on her face for one more second, but Richard could see how much effort it took. A misplaced sponsor badge, a late photographer, a missing speech card, or a governor's aide who needed a better seat. Clara could fix almost anything neatly and leave almost no trace behind. But Annie Brooks was not a seating problem. She was a child with a valid invitation, being kept outside a room built under Richard's own name. Richard, Clara said, lowering her voice. I need you inside with me. The final presentation is about to begin. Richard did not move. I'm not going in until you explain why Annie Brooks was removed from the list. Clara glanced at Annie, then at Marcus Hill, and then toward the ballroom doors. This is not the right place to discuss this. You made it the right place when you left her standing out here. That is not what happened. Then tell me what happened. Clara pressed the tablet against her side. There were last-minute concerns. The girl arrived without a parent. Security was uncertain. The list had to be adjusted before the ceremony began. Marcus lifted his head. Ma'am, that is not exactly what you told me. Clara turned sharply toward him. Mr. Hill, I gave you instructions based on the revised list. Richard looked at Marcus. What did she tell you? Marcus drew in a deep breath. He did not want to be caught between the billionaire whose name was on the event and the woman who had been giving orders all evening. But when he looked at Annie, his expression changed. She told me Annie Brooks had been marked as a duplicate file, Marcus said. Then she said a boy named Tyler Grayson would be arriving. When he gave his name, I was supposed to let him in to take the open scholarship slot. Clara spoke quickly. That is an oversimplification. Richard's eyes stayed fixed on her. Did you say that? I said Tyler should be admitted into Annie's place. After the adjustment, there was still an open seat. Richard took one step closer to her. There was no open seat. There was a seat you deliberately made open. Clara's face tightened. You were making this sound worse than it was. No, Richard said, I think I am finally hearing it clearly from inside the ballroom. Applause rose again. The host was trying to fill time with polished words about futures and opportunity. Richard heard his own name mentioned, followed by another round of applause. Clara leaned closer, her voice urgent. David Grayson is sitting in the front row. You know how important that relationship is. His company could help us expand the scholarship fund into 5 states next year. 5 states, Richard. Hundreds of children, thousands in the future. Richard said nothing. If Tyler receives a scholarship tonight, Clara continued, it sends a message to David that we value the partnership. It makes the next conversation easier. The funding package, the corporate matching gifts, the regional rollout, everything becomes easier. One honorary scholarship for his son could open doors for many other children. Annie stood perfectly still. She did not understand every term, but she understood enough. Richard saw her small fingers smoothing the edge of her dress. Clara followed his gaze and softened her voice. No one is saying Annie won't be helped. We can give her something separate. A private scholarship, a tutoring package, books, anything you want. But if we embarrass the Grayson family in front of everyone, the fund could lose real support before it even begins. Richard's voice dropped. So your plan was to take the scholarship from the child who earned it, give it to the son of a wealthy partner, and then send Annie home with a consolation prize. Clara exhaled through her nose. I made a strategic decision. Anger rose so quickly in Richard that he had to tighten his grip around Annie's invitation to stop himself from pointing it in Clara's face. A strategic decision? He asked. Clara straightened. Yes. A difficult choice. No. Richard's voice came out strained, making Marcus take half a step back. You do not get to call this strategy. You changed a child's scholarship without my approval. You altered a list bearing my name, the foundation seal, and my promise. You left a little girl standing outside the door while the whole room prepared to applaud someone else sitting in her place. Clara's face went pale. Richard, lower your voice. I will lower my voice when you explain why you thought you had the right to erase Annie Brooks from the list. A few guests near the check-in table turned to look. Clara noticed and lowered her voice even more. I was protecting the fund. You were protecting a deal. I was thinking long-term. You were thinking like someone who forgot why this fund was created. Clara clenched her jaw. That is unfair. Richard stepped closer, no longer concerned with making her comfortable. Unfair as a child arriving early with a valid invitation and being told to stand outside. Unfair as a mother working a hospital shift, trusting us to honor the invitation we sent her daughter. Unfair as deciding that the comfort of a wealthy man matters more than the dignity of a child. Annie looked down at the invitation in Richard's hand. He realized he was still holding it and immediately turned back to her. I'm sorry, he said, his voice softening. This belongs to you. He handed it back with both hands. Annie took it carefully. Clara seized the pause. Richard, please think about the public image. If you walk in there angry, the press will turn this into a story about money and favoritism. This is about favoritism. You know what I mean. Yes, Richard said, I know exactly what you mean. You are afraid people will call this what it is. Clara said nothing. Richard took out his phone and opened the foundation's admin portal. Show me the original list. I can't pull it up right now. I did not ask if it was convenient. Richard. Now Clara reluctantly unlocked her tablet, but Richard had already logged in on his own device. The dashboard appeared. He selected the scholarship list and opened the edit history. The first line appeared 001 Annie Brooks approved. Below it were the attachments: teacher recommendation letter, income verification documents, reading assessment results, invitation sent, confirmation code generated. Then came the edit status changed. Removed duplicate file edited by C. Whitmore. Time 5:14 p.m. 3 minutes later, Tyler Grayson manually added edited by C. Whitmore. Time 5:17 p.m. Richard turned the screen toward Clara. She looked at it and swallowed. There may have been a processing error, she said. Do not insult my intelligence. Richard, I can explain. You already have. Tyler's father could make the partnership easier. That is what you said. Clara's eyes flicked toward Annie. I did not mean to hurt the girl. That girl has a name. Clara immediately went silent. Richard looked at Marcus. How long has Annie been standing here? About 40 minutes, sir. And in those 40 minutes, did anyone call her mother? No, sir. I didn't see anyone make a call. Richard turned to Clara. Her mother's phone number is on the back of the invitation. Clara's shoulders stiffened. We were busy managing a live event. You were busy covering up a lie. The ballroom door opened and a worried staff member stepped out. Miss Whitmore, they're ready for Mr. Bennett on stage. The final scholarship presentation is about to begin. Richard glanced past him into the room. The stage lights were bright. The 12th chair was waiting with Tyler Grayson's name on it. David Grayson sat in the front row, smiling as if the evening had delivered exactly what he expected. Richard handed his phone to Marcus. Stay with Annie. Do not let anyone take her anywhere. Do not let anyone tell her to leave. Marcus nodded. Yes, sir. Clara stepped in front of Richard. Please don't do this in front of everyone. We can handle it quietly. Richard looked at her for a long moment. Silence is how you got away with it. At that moment, Annie spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it was enough to stop him before he reached the door. Mr. Bennett. He turned back. Yes, Annie. Are they mad because I came? The anger on Richard's face settled into something quieter and heavier. He bent slightly so he could look at her more clearly. No, he said, they are going to understand why you deserve to be welcomed. Annie held her invitation tightly. My mother said my name was first. Richard nodded. Your mother was right. If Annie's question touched your heart, please like this video and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Someone near you might be watching this story too. And if you believe every child deserves to be seen, respected, and welcomed, subscribe to the channel for more heartfelt stories. Behind him, Clara whispered, Richard, you are risking this partnership. He did not turn around. If a partnership requires me to steal an opportunity from a child, Richard said, then it was never worth keeping. Then Richard Bennett opened the ballroom doors and walked straight toward the stage. The ballroom did not quiet at once. Richard had entered too many rooms to expect that. At first, people saw only what they had been told to see, the founder of the fund finally arriving. The man whose name had been printed on the invitations. The man whose late entrance could be turned into a warm joke by a skilled master of ceremonies. A few donors started to clap. Someone near the front stood halfway, then sat again when Richard did not smile. The master of ceremonies, a local television anchor with silver hair and a practiced voice, brightened when he saw him. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Richard Bennett has joined us just in time for our final scholarship presentation. Richard took the microphone from him gently, not rudely, but with enough certainty that the man let go. Thank you, Tom, Richard said. I need a moment before we continue. That did it. The last murmurs thinned. Forks rested against plates. A photographer lowered his camera, then lifted it again when he noticed Richard's face. On the stage, 11 children sat in their white chairs with certificates on their laps, some swinging their feet, some staring out at the crowd. At the end of the row, Tyler Grayson sat in the 12th chair, wearing a navy blazer and a striped tie. He looked clean, nervous, and too young to understand why the air around him had changed. David Grayson sat in the front row beside his wife, one ankle crossed over his knee, a confident smile still fixed in place. He gave Richard a small nod. The kind men give when they believe business has already made the room safe for them. Richard did not return it. He looked at the banner behind the children. 12 seats, 12 futures, one promise. Then he looked at the 12th chair. Before I say what I came here to say, Richard began. I want everyone in this room to understand something. This fund was created for children whose names are too often misplaced, overlooked, or treated as less important than the names of people with money. A low stir moved through the room. Clara had slipped in through the side door and now stood near the wall, her tablet pressed against her chest. Her face told Richard she was still hoping he might speak in general terms, smooth the corner, protect the evening. He had no intention of protecting a lie. This ceremony began a few minutes ago, Richard continued. But one of tonight's scholarship recipients was not in this room. David's smile faded. Richard turned slightly toward the open ballroom doors. Annie was still in the hallway beside Marcus. Visible beyond the threshold, she had not stepped inside. The invitation was held against her dress and her eyes were on the stage, not on the crowd. Richard spoke toward her as much as toward the room. Her name is Annie Brooks. The name landed differently from a statistic. A few people turned in their chairs. A woman in the second row whispered, is that the little girl outside? Richard nodded toward the event technician near the screen. Please pull up the confirmation record for Annie Brooks. Code AB0001. The technician looked at Clara. Clara did not move. Richard did not raise his voice. Now, please, the man typed quickly. For several seconds, the large screen behind the stage stayed blue. Richard could hear every small sound in the room. Ice shifting in a glass, a child clearing his throat, the faint buzz of camera equipment. Then the record appeared. Valid Annie Brooks Scholarship Recipient Number 0001. Beneath it was the foundation seal and Richard's printed signature. No one clapped. The silence was better. Richard turned back to the audience. That is the official invitation record issued by my foundation. It is valid. It has a confirmation code, a seat assignment, the foundation seal, and my signature. Annie Brooks was not a guest. She was not a late addition. She was not a mistake. She was the first child selected. At the end of the row, Tyler looked down at the card in front of his chair. He read his own name, then looked toward the hallway. David Grayson stood. Richard, surely this can be handled privately. Richard looked at him. It could have been handled privately when a child was first stopped at the door. David's face tightened. My son is sitting there. Don't drag him into an administrative problem. I agree. Richard said Tyler should not have been dragged into it. He did not create this. He is a child and I will not blame a child for the choices of adults. Tyler's mother put a hand on her son's shoulder and the boy sat very still. Richard continued. But the seat he is sitting in was assigned to Annie Brooks. David's voice sharpened. Are you saying my son is not welcome here? I am saying he was placed in a seat that was not his. The room shifted again. People understood the difference, and that made the truth harder to avoid. Clara stepped forward before David could answer. Mr. Bennett, there was a last-minute review. Annie arrived without a guardian, and for safety reasons. Richard turned to her. Do not say safety when you mean convenience. A few people drew in quiet breaths. Clara's face hardened. Richard faced the audience again. Annie Brooks arrived early. She presented a valid invitation. Her mother's phone number was written on the back in case there was any concern. No one called her mother. Instead, Annie was told to wait outside while this room prepared to give her scholarship to someone else. A woman near the back shook her head. One of the school principals leaned toward another and whispered something Richard could not hear. Several reporters were now recording openly. Clara tried once more. Richard, I can explain the partnership considerations. He did not look at her. Not yet. Then he looked at Tyler. The boy's cheeks were red. His hands had closed around the edges of his chair. Richard lowered his tone. Tyler, none of this is your fault. The boy swallowed. Am I supposed to move? David snapped. Tyler, stay where you are. Richard did not challenge the father directly. He kept his eyes on the boy. You are not being punished. But I need to tell the truth about this chair. Tyler looked toward the hallway again. Annie was watching him, not angry, not proud, just waiting to see what adults would decide about her name. The boy stood up, his father's head turned fast. Tyler. Tyler did not look at him. He picked up the name card from the chair, read it once, then set it down on the seat. His voice was small, but the microphone near the stage caught enough of it. It has her name on the screen. For a moment, no one moved. Then an older woman near the back began to clap. Not loudly, not for show. Just two hands meeting because something honest had finally entered the room. A man beside her joined. Then a teacher, then another table. The applause grew uneven but real. Richard did not let it become a performance. He raised one hand and the room settled. Thank you, Tyler, he said. That took character. Tyler looked down, embarrassed, but less trapped than before. His mother guided him gently to a chair beside her. David Grayson stayed standing, his face pale with anger. Richard turned toward the hallway. Annie, he said, his voice carrying but not pushing. You do not have to come in until you are ready. But your seat is here. Annie did not move at first. Marcus bent slightly and said something to her that Richard could not hear. She looked down at her invitation, then at the screen where her name remained in green letters. Slowly, she stepped across the threshold. No music played, no spotlight followed her. It was better that way. She walked in holding the ticket her mother had trusted past tables of adults who now had to look at her directly. Some smiled, some looked ashamed, a few wiped at their eyes. Richard watched only Annie. He wanted the room to learn what he had learned in the hallway. A child does not need to cry to show she has been hurt. And she does not need to shout to deserve justice. When she reached the stage steps, Richard came down to meet her. Would you like me to bring the certificate to you? He asked quietly. Or would you like to walk up? Annie looked at the 12 chairs. Then she looked back at him. I can walk, she said. Richard nodded and stepped aside. Annie climbed the steps, one hand on the rail, the invitation still in the other. She reached the 12th chair and saw the empty place waiting. The technician had already changed the small stage display. Annie Brooks, recipient number 001. She sat down carefully as though the chair might disappear if she moved too fast. Richard returned to the microphone. This is what correction looks like, he said, not hiding the mistake, not explaining it away. Returning what belongs, where it should have been from the beginning. At the side of the room, Clara stared at him with a look that was no longer polished, no longer careful, and no longer in control. Richard turned toward her and now he said, we are going to discuss who moved Annie Brooks's name. Richard did not ask Clara to come to the stage. He asked the truth to come there, and that was worse. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Annie sat in the 12th chair with the certificate folder resting unopened on her knees. The 11 other children watched Richard with the wide uncertain attention children give adults when adult voices become too scary. Tyler sat beside his mother in the front row, his shoulders rounded, while David Grayson remained standing as if sitting down would make him lose ground. Clara stayed near the wall. Her tablet was still tucked against her ribs, but it no longer looked like a tool. It looked like a shield. Richard turned to the event technician. Please leave Annie's confirmation record on the screen. The technician nodded without looking at Clara. Richard then looked toward Marcus, who was still by the ballroom doors. Mr. Hill, would you come in, please? Marcus stepped inside slowly. A few heads turned toward him. He had spent most of the evening being invisible in a black security jacket, opening doors for donors who did not remember his face. Now the room was looking at him as if he were part of the program. Richard softened his tone. I'm going to ask you a few questions. Just answer what you know. Yes, sir. When Annie Brooks arrived, did she present an invitation? Yes, sir. Did the invitation appear official? It did. Did she argue with you? No, sir. Did she cause any disturbance? No, sir. She was polite. She asked if I could check again. Richard nodded once. And why did you not allow her inside? Marcus looked toward Clara, then back to Richard. Because Miss Whitmore told me the list had been updated. She said Annie Brooks was removed as a duplicate entry. A murmur moved through the tables. Clara stepped forward. Richard, this is becoming unfair to staff. Richard turned to her. You were right, so let's be fair. Did you tell Mr. Hill that Annie had been removed? Clara's smile returned thinner now. I relayed the updated roster. Did you update the roster? That is not how the process works. Richard held up his phone. The change history says otherwise. Clara's eyes went to the screen in his hand. She knew what was there. He had shown her in the hallway, but now the room needed to hear it. Richard spoke to the audience, not loudly, but clearly enough that every table went still. At 5:14 this evening, Annie Brooks was marked as removed from the scholarship roster. The reason entered was duplicate entry. The account that made that change was Clara Whitmore's at 517. Tyler Grayson was added manually to the 12th seat. That change was also made from Clara Whitmore's account. David Grayson's wife put a hand to her mouth. David's face hardened, not with surprise, but with calculation. Clara said, my account is used for administrative updates all the time. Richard looked at her. Did someone else use it tonight? She hesitated. 1 second. Enough. No, she said, but you are missing the larger issue. There is no larger issue than a child being removed from a scholarship she earned. There is, Clara said, and now her voice lost some of its polish. The larger issue is sustainability. You wanted this fund to grow. You wanted national partners, regional sponsors, corporate matching. I made a call that protected the future of the program. Richard stared at her by taking from Annie by managing a difficult situation. A difficult situation you created. Clara looked around the room and for the first time she seemed to remember the reporters. She lowered her voice, but microphones were still close enough to catch pieces of it. David Grayson's support could have opened doors in 5 states. Tyler's inclusion tonight was symbolic. We could have taken care of Annie separately. Annie looked down at her certificate folder. Richard saw it and felt his anger sharpen again. Separately, he repeated. Clara turned toward the stage, trying to speak as if Annie were not old enough to understand. No one intended harm. She would have received assistance, perhaps even more assistance. But a public ceremony is also about relationships. Richard stepped away from the microphone for a moment, then came back to it. He needed the room to hear this cleanly. This is not a misunderstanding, he said. This is not paperwork. This is a grown adult deciding that a child without power could be moved aside because another child had a powerful father. David Grayson spoke from the front row. Careful, Richard. Richard looked at him. I am being careful. That is why I am saying only what the records show. David's jaw worked. You are making my son look like he stole something. No, Richard said. Adults did that. Tyler did not. Tyler stared at the floor. Richard looked toward him. Tyler, I meant what I said. You are not at fault. The boy gave a small nod, still embarrassed, but he did not hide behind his father. Clara tried again. Richard, for heaven's sake, this could ruin the entire launch. Richard turned back to her. Then perhaps the launch needed to be stopped before it began on a lie. The room went quiet in a way that carried weight. The donors were no longer watching a mistake get fixed. They were watching a line get drawn. Richard set the microphone down on the podium and stepped closer to Clara. Close enough that he did not need to project. Yet the room was so still that people heard him anyway. You had no authority to remove Annie Brooks. Clara's lips pressed together. You had no authority to alter a scholarship decision I approved. She said nothing. You had no authority to trade a child's place for business access. Her eyes flashed. You built a company on access. I built this fund because I remembered what it felt like not to have any. That stopped her. It stopped Richard too for half a breath. He had not planned to say it. He rarely spoke about the boy he had been. The boy with one good shirt for school assemblies. The boy whose mother kept scholarship forms in a plastic grocery bag so rain would not ruin them. The boy who knew adults could change a life with a signature or crush it by pretending the paper got lost. He turned back to the room. When I was young, a teacher put my name forward for a scholarship. Not because my family knew anyone, not because my mother had money, because someone looked at my work and said, this child earned a chance. I have never forgotten that. And tonight under my own name, we nearly told Annie Brooks that her chance could be handed to someone else if the deal was big enough. An older man near the side table removed his glasses and looked down. A principal in the second row wiped at one eye with her thumb. The reporters kept recording, but even they seemed less eager now, as if the story had become too human to treat as a clean scandal. Richard faced Clara again. You said you were protecting the fund. I was. No, you were protecting influence. The fund exists to protect children from exactly that. Clara's voice lowered. So what happens now? You fire me in front of everyone. Richard held her gaze. No, I hold you accountable in front of the people whose trust you used. A staff member near the side entrance shifted uncomfortable. Denise Bennett, Richard's younger sister in the fund's communications chair, had entered during the exchange. She stood near the back with her phone in one hand, her face pale. Richard saw the warning in her eyes. Press, donors, contracts, headlines. He understood all of it. Then he looked at Annie. She was sitting upright, both feet together, the invitation still in her hands, though the certificate lay on her lap. She had been given back her seat, but not yet her safety. Not yet the certainty that no one could quietly undo it when the room emptied. Richard picked up the microphone again. Clara Whitmore, he said, effective immediately. You were removed from all duties related to Bennett Future Scholars Fund and suspended from Bennett Global Group pending formal review. A hard breath moved through the room. Clara's face went white. Richard, you will surrender your tablet, event credentials, and access permissions to legal before leaving this building. You cannot be serious. I am. This is a public humiliation. Richard's voice did not rise. So was leaving Annie Brooks outside with a valid ticket. Clara looked toward David Grayson as if expecting support. David did not move. Powerful. Men often loved loyalty until it became expensive. Denise stepped forward quietly and signaled to two members of the legal team near the sidewall. They approached Clara with professional calm. Clara did not make a scene. That was not her style. She removed her headset, placed it on the tablet, and handed both over with fingers that trembled only once. As she passed Richard, she said under her breath, you may have just cost yourself millions. Richard looked toward the stage where Annie's name still glowed on the screen. No, he said, I just remembered what this was worth. Clara walked out through the side door. No applause followed her. No one needed it. Accountability was not theater. It was a door closing softly behind the person who had tried to close it on a child. Richard turned back to the audience. This evening will continue, he said, but not as planned. Before another photograph is taken, every scholarship record will be reviewed. Every child's name will be verified, and every parent or guardian will receive confirmation directly from my office. He paused, starting with Mrs. Brooks. Annie looked up at the mention of her mother. Richard stepped down from the podium and walked toward her chair. He did not touch her shoulder. He did not ask her to smile for the cameras. He only bent slightly and said, your mother should hear your name called properly. Would that be all right? Annie looked at her ticket, then at him. Yes, sir, she said. She would like that. Richard nodded for the first time since he had entered the ballroom. The evening was no longer moving according to Clara's schedule, David Grayson's expectations, or the printed program folded beside every plate. It was moving according to the one thing that should have guided it from the beginning, the name on the invitation. Richard asked for a chair to be brought near the front of the stage, not for himself, but for the phone call. That small choice changed the room more than another speech could have. The guests watched as a staff member placed a plain chair beside the podium, close enough for the microphone to catch a voice on speaker, but not close enough to turn Annie into a display. Do you want to call her? Richard asked Annie, or would you like me to? Annie looked at the invitation in her lap. You can call first. Mama might think something bad happened if I call from a different phone. That's smart, Richard said. Annie did not smile, but she looked pleased that he had not called her carefulness fear. Richard dialed the number on the back of the invitation. The ballroom stayed quiet. No one ate. No one whispered loudly. Even the reporters seemed to understand that some moments should not be swallowed by cameras. Angela Brooks answered on the third ring. Hello, Mrs. Brooks. This is Richard Bennett again. A rush of hospital noise moved behind her voice. A rolling cart. A distant page over the speaker. Someone asking for room numbers. Mr. Bennett, is Annie all right? She is with me. She is safe. And I would like your permission to put you on speaker. Annie is here and the room needs to hear what should have happened when she arrived. There was a pause. The room. Yes, ma'am. The scholarship ceremony. Angela's voice tightened. Is my daughter on that stage? She is seated in the place that belongs to her. This time, the silence was different. It held relief, but also the weight of a mother who had been holding her breath between hospital beds. Yes, Angela said. Put me on. Richard set the phone on the podium and leaned close. Mrs. Brooks, can you hear me? I can. Annie leaned forward in her chair. Mama. Oh, baby. Angela's voice broke slightly, then steadied. I'm here. Are you sitting down? Yes, ma'am. They put my name on the screen. Somewhere in the room, a woman covered her mouth. Angela took a breath. That's because your name belongs there. Richard watched Annie's shoulders settle, not relax completely. Children who had been embarrassed in front of adults did not become comfortable because a room finally behaved, but she sat a little taller. Richard turned to the audience. Mrs. Brooks, before we continue, I owe you an apology. Your daughter arrived with a valid invitation. She should have been welcomed, checked in, and seated. Instead, she was left outside because her name had been improperly removed from our list. That happened under my foundation's name, and I am responsible for making it right. Angela did not answer quickly. When she did, her words came slowly, each one chosen while the hospital moved around her. Mr. Bennett, I work 12-hour shifts, sometimes 16. I do not have the kind of job where I can leave because my child has a program. I hated sending her without me, but I trusted that invitation because your foundation sent it. I told Annie, show them your ticket. They'll know what to do. Richard lowered his eyes. Angela continued, my daughter did not come there asking for special treatment. She came because she earned something. Yes, ma'am, Richard said. And if someone looked at her standing alone and decided she was the easiest child to move out of the way, then that person counted wrong. No one in the ballroom moved. Richard looked toward the side door where Clara had exited. They did. Annie picked up the phone with both hands, though it stayed on speaker. Mama, Mr. Bennett, said my ticket was real. I knew it was real. They put another name on my chair. I know, baby. I didn't yell. I know you didn't. I just waited like you said. Angela's voice softened. You did right, but listen to me now. Being polite does not mean letting people take what has your name on it. The sentence stayed in the room after she said it. Richard knew the older guests heard more than a mother speaking to a daughter. They heard the kind of lesson many of them had learned late and wished someone had said earlier. Richard took the microphone again. Mrs. Brooks, with your permission, I would like to present Annie's scholarship now properly. You have my permission, Angela said. And Mr. Bennett. Yes, ma'am. Please don't make her stand up there like she's a lesson for everybody. She's a child. Richard looked at Annie, then at the cameras. You are right. He turned to the photographers near the aisle. No close photographs of Annie unless Mrs. Brooks approves them later. No interviews. No crowding her after the ceremony. This is her scholarship, not a press opportunity. One reporter lowered his camera at once. Another hesitated, then did the same. Richard lifted the certificate folder from the podium. It had been printed on thick cream paper with a blue border, the foundation seal at the top, and Annie's name in dark ink. He did not ask Annie to stand at center stage. He walked to her chair and handed it to her there. Annie Brooks, he said, letting the microphone carry his voice without making it too grand. You were selected first because your teachers saw your effort. Your reading scores showed your work, and your application reminded this foundation why it exists. This scholarship belongs to you. Annie took the certificate with both hands. She looked at it for several seconds before reading her name aloud under her breath. Annie Brooks. Angela heard it through the phone and made a small sound. Half laugh, half prayer. Richard asked, would you like to say anything, Annie? You do not have to. Annie looked at the room. Her eyes moved over the donors, the teachers, Tyler, and his mother, Marcus, by the door. And finally, the phone where her mother was waiting. She held up the ticket, not the certificate. My mama said I was invited, she said. I just wanted somebody to believe the ticket. That was all. No polished speech could have carried more weight. The applause began slowly this time, not because people were unsure, but because they were careful. Then it grew. Annie did not bow or wave. She simply sat with her certificate in her lap and her ticket resting on top of it, as if the paper that proved she belonged mattered just as much as the award itself. Richard waited until the applause faded. There will be an internal review tonight, he said. Not tomorrow. Tonight. Every record, every change, every child's status. The Bennett Future Scholars Fund will not move forward by hoping this was the only mistake. We will prove it. David Grayson stood again. His face had gone red around the collar. Richard, I think we should speak privately before you create more damage. Richard turned to him. The damage was created when a child was removed to please you. David's wife touched his arm. David, sit down. He did not. Are you accusing me of asking for this? I am asking whether you knew your son was not selected. David's mouth opened, then closed. Tyler looked up at his father. That look answered more than David did. Richard nodded once as if something had been confirmed. David's anger hardened into silence. Annie leaned toward the phone. Mama, do I stay now? Angela answered without hesitation. Yes, baby, you stay. That room finally caught up with you. A few people laughed softly, not at Annie, but from the relief of hearing a mother put truth into plain words. Richard looked around the ballroom at the untouched desserts, the program cards, the donors who had come for a smooth evening and found themselves sitting inside a moral failure. He did not regret that. Smooth evenings had their place. So did broken ones. If breaking them let the truth breathe. He stepped back to the podium. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, we will finish this ceremony, but we will finish it differently. Tonight is not about how generous adults look when they give. It is about whether we can be trusted with the names of children who have less power than we do. He looked at Annie's ticket one more time. Every name will be checked. Every promise will be honored. And no child invited by this foundation will ever again be left outside while adults discuss opportunity in the room. For the first time that night, the banner behind him did not feel like decoration. It felt like a standard the room had finally been forced to meet. Richard did not leave the ballroom right away. He let the ceremony breathe for a few minutes, not because the damage had been repaired, but because 11 other children were still sitting on that stage holding certificates they had earned. They had not caused the lie. They did not deserve to have the whole night remembered only for the adults who had tried to bend it. So he called each remaining child by name again. Not quickly, not as a formality. He asked the audience to stand for all 12 recipients. And when they did, he made sure Annie's name was spoken first. Annie Brooks. She looked up from her certificate. The room answered with applause. Warmer now, steadier. Then Richard continued down the list. Each child received their moment. A boy from Decatur who wanted to build robots. A girl from College Park whose teacher said she read during recess. Twin brothers from East Point who had raised their math scores after school in the library. Their parents and grandparents clapped, some with hands raised, some with phones held high, some wiping eyes with napkins from the dessert table. Richard watched it all with a different kind of attention. The evening had been designed to look generous. Now it had to become honest. After the final photograph was taken from a careful distance, he stepped off the stage and walked to Annie. The cameras shifted toward him, but he raised one hand. No closer, he said. The nearest photographer stopped. Annie had her certificate in one hand and her invitation in the other. The ticket was more wrinkled now, but she had smoothed it across her lap as if trying to make it respectable again. Your mother is still on the phone? Richard asked. Annie held up the device. She had to put it in her pocket for a minute. A nurse needed her. Richard nodded. That sounds like your mother. Annie considered that she helps people even when she's tired. I believe it. The phone crackled and Angela's voice returned. I heard that. Annie leaned in. Mama, he said, you help people. Angela gave a tired laugh. Tell Mr. Bennett not to make me sound nicer than I am. I'm still mad. Richard took the phone gently when Annie offered it. You have every right to be. I know, Angela said. That's why I'm using it carefully. Richard almost smiled. Mrs. Brooks, I need to review the records now. Denise Bennett, my communications chair, will stay with Annie until you arrive or until we arrange a safe ride with your approval. Marcus Hill will remain nearby. No one will move her without your permission. Who is Denise? My sister. There was a pause. Put Annie near a woman, not in some back office with men in suits. Yes, ma'am. And she seats when the other children eat. She doesn't sit somewhere like she's waiting for permission. Richard looked at the dessert tables. Plates of chicken salad sliders, fruit cups, macaroni and cheese bites, cookies, lemonade. She will eat with the other recipients. I packed crackers in her bag because I didn't know what they'd serve, Angela said. Quieter now. Annie looked embarrassed. Mama, that's what mothers do, Angela said. We pack crackers and worry. Richard felt the sentence more than he expected. I'll make sure she has dinner. Thank you. And Mr. Bennett, yes. Find out who else got moved. Richard looked toward the side door where Clara had disappeared with legal staff. That is exactly what I intend to do. He ended the call only after Annie promised her mother she would stay with Miss Denise and answer when called. Denise had already come forward, a composed woman in her late 40s with short silver brown hair and a navy dress. She did not rush Annie. She took the chair beside her, leaving space. Hi, Annie, Denise said. I'm Denise. I'm Richard's sister. I'm going to sit right here unless you want me somewhere else. Annie studied her. Do you work here, too? Tonight, I do. Mostly. I tell my brother when he's about to say something foolish in public. Annie glanced at Richard. Does he listen? Not often enough. For the first time, Annie's mouth moved close to a smile. Richard left her there with Denise and Marcus near the aisle. Then he walked into a small conference room behind the ballroom where the legal team had opened laptops on a long table. The room smelled of coffee, printer paper, and the kind of panic that comes when a celebration turns into evidence. 2 attorneys from Bennett Global were already inside. So was the IT manager, a thin man named Peter Lang, who looked as if he wished he had chosen another career. Clara sat at the far end of the table. No headset now, no tablet. Her hands were folded tightly in front of her. Richard entered and closed the door. No one spoke first. He looked at Peter. Pull the full scholarship roster. Original approvals. Change history. Access logs. Emails tied to edits and every manual override. Peter nodded quickly, already exporting. Good. Put it on the screen. The wall monitor blinked on. Names appeared in a spreadsheet. 12 recipients, each with a number, school, district, need. Verification, teacher recommendation, approval date. Annie Brooks was at the top. Richard pointed. Start with her file. Peter opened it. There was the application, the reading assessment, a note from Annie's teacher describing her as quietly determined, unusually advanced in reading comprehension, and happiest when given a book she has not seen before. There was Angela's income documentation, a hospital employment letter, and a handwritten parent statement that had been scanned into the system. Richard did not read it aloud, but his eyes caught one line. I cannot give Annie everything, but I am trying to get her close enough to opportunity that she can reach the rest herself. He looked away for a moment. Show me the change. Peter clicked into the log. 5:14 p.m. Status changed from approved to remove duplicate entry. User C. Whitmore 5:17 p.m. Manual recipient added Tyler Grayson. User C. Whitmore 5:21 p.m. Seat assignment updated. Seat 12. User C. Whitmore 5:24 p.m. Security roster exported. User C. Whitmore. Richard turned to Clara. You changed the scholarship roster, the seating chart, and the security list. Clara lifted her chin. I did what I believed would protect the fund's growth. One attorney, a woman named Meredith Shaw, spoke carefully. Clara, I advise you not to characterize intent until we complete the review. Clara ignored her. No, I want to be clear. David Grayson had been delaying his commitment for months. He wanted a sign that this partnership mattered to Richard personally. Richard stared at her. A sign, yes. Including Tyler would have cost us nothing. Annie could still have been supported separately. We could have given her more, frankly. But David needed to see goodwill. Goodwill purchased with a child's chair. Clara's eyes flashed. Do not pretend business never funds charity. You know how these rooms work. I know exactly how these rooms work, Richard said. That is why this fund was supposed to be different. Peter shifted in his seat. Sir, there's more. Everyone turned. Peter opened another tab. There are 2 draft emails in Miss Whitmore's account. One to Mrs. Brooks, unsent one to David Grayson's assistant. Richard's voice was flat. Open the one to Mrs. Brooks. The email appeared. Dear Mrs. Brooks, due to an administrative duplication, Annie's participation in tonight's ceremony has been postponed. We apologize for any inconvenience and will contact you regarding future opportunities. Richard read it once. Postponed. Future opportunities. Inconvenience. He thought of Annie standing in the hallway holding a ticket that had already been reduced to an inconvenience in an unsent email. Open the other one, he said. P to D. Mr. Grayson, we are pleased to confirm Tyler's inclusion in tonight's scholarship presentation. Mr. Bennett values the continued partnership between our organizations and looks forward to discussing expanded collaboration after the ceremony. No one moved. Richard looked at Clara. You weren't fixing confusion. You planned it. Clara's voice lowered. I made a judgment call. You wrote Annie out before she arrived. I expected her mother to receive the email, but you did not send it. There wasn't time. There was time to add Tyler. Clara looked away. Meredith closed her laptop halfway. Richard, we need to preserve all records. No one should delete, alter, or access Clara's account except it and legal from this point forward. Do it, Richard said. Peter nodded. I'll lock the account now. Clara turned sharply. You can't lock me out of my own work. Richard answered before Meredith could. You turned your work into evidence. Clara stood, the chair scraping against the carpet. You were making a mistake. David will walk. The rollout will stall. The board will ask whether your emotions damage the fund before its first year. Richard looked at her for a long moment. Let them ask. I will answer with Annie's ticket. For once, Clara had no reply. A knock came at the door. Denise stepped in partway, her voice low. Richard, Angela Brooks is on her way. She got released early from the hospital. Also, Annie asked if she is allowed to eat the macaroni bites. Richard's face softened. Tell her she is not only allowed, she is expected. Denise nodded, then looked at Clara without warmth before closing the door again. Richard turned back to the screen. Review the other 11 files. I want confirmation that no other child was moved, delayed, substituted, or downgraded. Peter's fingers moved quickly. Yes, sir. As the names opened one by one, Richard stood at the head of the table and watched. He was not thinking about David Grayson anymore. He was not thinking about the cameras, the donors, or the headlines that would come by morning. He was thinking of a mother packing crackers into a child's bag because she did not know whether a room full of generous people would remember to feed her. He was thinking of Annie's question. Are they going to be mad because I came? And he was thinking that the most dangerous wrongs were often not done by people who hated children. They were done by people who found polite reasons to move them aside. Peter worked through the roster in silence, opening one file after another while Richard stood behind him and watched every line. The other 11 children appeared clean. No last-minute removals, no substitutions, no manual additions after final approval. For each name, there was a teacher letter, a need assessment, a parent contact, and a confirmation code. Ordinary paperwork, suddenly sacred because one person had treated it like something she could bend. At the end of the table, Clara sat with her arms crossed, saying nothing. Her account had been locked. Her tablet lay in a clear evidence bag beside Meredith Shaw's laptop. Without her headset and schedule, she looked less like the woman who had run the evening and more like someone waiting to see how much damage could still be negotiated. Peter opened the final log. That's all 12, sir. Annie is the only altered recipient. Richard did not feel relief. Only one child moved is not a small number. No, sir, Peter said. Meredith looked up from her notes. We'll need written statements from everyone who touched the roster. Security, event staff, communications. We also need to notify the board that a scholarship record was altered and a recipient was improperly removed. Do it tonight, Richard said. Clara let out a small laugh. You're going to send an emergency notice to the board over one corrected seat. Richard turned to her. I'm going to send an emergency notice because the first act of this fund was almost a fraud. A fraud. Clara's voice sharpened. That is a legal word. Be careful. Meredith looked at Clara. You should be careful, too. Clara leaned back, anger finally breaking through the thin layer of professionalism she had kept around herself. All of you are acting as if I stole money from the child. I didn't. I moved a public F-facing award. There were other ways to support her. Richard stared at her. You still think the chair was only symbolic? It was. No. To you, it was symbolic because you had never been the child waiting to hear your name. The room went quiet again. But Richard did not stay in it. He had said what needed to be said there. The rest belonged to lawyers. Annie belonged in the ballroom with food, her certificate, and adults who would not talk about her as if she were an item on an agenda. He turned to Meredith. Make sure Clara is escorted out through the staff exit after legal takes her statement. No press. No confrontation. Clara looked at him, quickly, almost suspicious. You're protecting me now. No, Richard said. I'm protecting the children from another scene. He left the conference room before she could answer. Back in the ballroom, the atmosphere had changed. The music was lower. Parents were gathered around their children taking photographs near the stage. But the bright, careless mood of the original program was gone. In its place was something more honest. People spoke quietly. They listened before interrupting. Several donors stood near the back, not leaving. Not knowing what to do with the discomfort in their hands. Annie sat at a round table near the front with Denise beside her and Marcus a few steps away. A plate had been placed in front of her. 2 macaroni bites, a small chicken slider, grapes, and a cookie. She had not touched. The certificate rested in its blue folder next to her elbow. The invitation lay on top of it. Richard stopped a few feet from the table. May I sit? Annie looked at Denise first. Denise gave no instruction. She only waited. Annie nodded. Yes, sir. Richard pulled out a chair, leaving one seat between them. He noticed Annie's plate. Good choices. My mama says grapes count even if there's cookies. That sounds like something a mother would know. She said I should eat real food before sweet food. Annie looked at the cookie. But I'm saving it. Maybe mama wants half. Richard felt the sentence settle in his chest. We can get another cookie for your mother. Annie shook her head. This one is already mine. I can share it. Denise looked away for a moment, pretending to check her phone. Richard kept his voice. Even your mother is on her way. She got off work. She did. Annie picked up a grape but did not eat it. Is she going to be mad at you? No. At them. Richard considered lying in a softer shape, then chose not to. Probably. Annie nodded as if that seemed fair. A woman in a green dress approached the table with careful steps. She was older, perhaps in her 60s, with a church pin on her lapel and eyes that had been red recently. She stopped at a respectful distance. "Mr. Bennett," she said, "may I speak to Annie for just a second?" Richard looked at Annie. "That's up to her." The woman seemed to appreciate that. She turned to Annie. "Honey, I'm Mrs. Caldwell. I taught second grade for 34 years. I just wanted to say I'm sorry nobody walked you in when you arrived. Somebody should have." Annie looked at her plate. "It's okay." Mrs. Caldwell shook her head gently. "No, baby, it isn't, but I thank you for standing long enough for the truth to catch up." Annie's eyes lifted. She did not know what to do with that, but she heard it. "Thank you," she said. Mrs. Caldwell touched her own heart once and walked away. After that, others wanted to come over, but Denise quietly intercepted them. "Not now," she said with a smile that did not invite debate. "Annie is having dinner." Marcus stood like a wall near the aisle. When a photographer tried to angle for a close shot, Marcus stepped into the frame. "No close photos," he said. The photographer frowned. "I'm with the journal and I'm with the door," Marcus replied. Annie heard him and looked down quickly, hiding the smallest smile. Richard saw it. "Mr. Hill takes instructions seriously." "He didn't know," Annie said. "No, he didn't. He looked at my ticket twice." Richard glanced toward Marcus. "I know." Annie finally ate the grape. "Is he in trouble?" "No." "Good." That answer told Richard something about her. She knew the difference between a person who made a bad choice and a person who had been handed a bad instruction. Many adults in the room were still learning that. The ballroom doors opened near the lobby entrance. Angela Brooks came in wearing pale blue scrubs under a dark coat. Her work shoes damp from the rain outside. She moved fast at first, then stopped when she saw the crowd, the lights, the stage, and her daughter sitting at a table near the front with a certificate folder beside her. Annie stood so quickly her chair scraped the carpet. "Mama." Angela did not call across the room. She walked straight to her daughter, one hand pressed against her chest like she was keeping herself together until she reached the table. When Annie came around the chair, Angela knelt and pulled her close. Not a dramatic embrace, not the kind made for cameras. A working mother's hold, firm, tired, thankful, and angry enough to protect. Richard stood but did not approach. Angela held Annie at arm's length and looked her over. "You ate some grapes, Annie, and macaroni." Angela glanced at the plate. "That's one bite. I was saving the cookie for you." Angela's face changed. She closed her eyes once, then opened them. "I don't need the cookie, baby." "I know, but I saved it." Angela pulled her close again. Richard waited until she looked up. "Mrs. Brooks." Angela rose, keeping one hand on Annie's shoulder. "Mr. Bennett, I'm sorry. You said that already. I know it deserves saying twice." Angela studied him. Her face showed exhaustion, rain, worry, and the sharp intelligence of a woman who had learned to measure apologies by what came after them. "Who changed her name?" she asked. "My assistant, Clara Whitmore." "Why?" Richard did not soften it. "To give the seat to the son of a business partner." Angela's hand tightened on Annie's shoulder. "Because she thought nobody would fight for mine." "Yes," Richard said. "I believe that is exactly what she thought." Angela looked around the ballroom at the donors who were trying not to stare. At the banner, at the 12 chairs. "That's the part people don't like to say plain." Richard nodded. "Tonight we're saying it plain. What happens to the assistant?" "She has been removed from the fund and suspended from my company pending formal review. Her access is locked. Legal is preserving the records. If the review finds violations that need to be reported, they will be." Angela looked at him for a long moment. "And Annie keeps her scholarship. Her name remains recipient number 1. Tomorrow, my office will send you the full award packet directly. Not through an assistant, not through a partner. Directly." Angela's expression did not soften much. "And next time a child comes without a parent because that parent is at work," Richard answered, "there will be a child check-in advocate at the door. Every invited child will be verified by ticket, code, and parent contact. No child will be left waiting in a hallway because adults are too busy being important." Angela looked down at Annie. "You hear that?" Annie nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Angela looked back at Richard. "Then write it down. Promises sound better when they have signatures." For the first time that night, Richard almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because she was exactly right. "I will," he said. "And you'll receive a copy." Denise stepped forward. "Mrs. Brooks, I'm Denise Bennett. I'll make sure you get that in writing before you leave tonight." Angela gave her a brief nod. "Thank you." At the front of the room, Tom, the MC, hovered near the microphone, unsure whether the event was over. Richard noticed him and shook his head slightly. "Not yet," he He turned back to Annie. There is one more thing, if you're willing. I would like your mother to hear your name announced the way it should have been the first time. Annie looked at Angela. Angela bent slightly. Do you want that? Annie looked toward the stage. Her chair was still there. Her name still glowed on the display. I think so, she said. Angela straightened. Then we'll hear it. Richard walked to the podium. This time he did not carry anger. He carried responsibility. It was heavier. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, before we close tonight, we are going to do one thing again correctly. The room turned toward him. Richard looked at Annie, then at Angela standing beside her in hospital scrubs, one hand on her daughter's shoulder. Our first Bennett Future Scholar, he said. The child whose name should have opened this ceremony is Annie Brooks. The applause came at once, but Annie did not move until her mother whispered something in her ear. Go ahead, baby. This time. Walk in like they called you. Annie did not hurry. She walked toward the stage with her mother beside her, not ahead of her, not behind her. Angela had one hand near Annie's back without pushing. The applause followed them, but it did not swallow the moment this time. It sounded different now, less like a performance, more like people standing witness to a wrong being named and corrected. At the first step, Annie paused and looked at her mother. Angela leaned close. You want me to come up with you? Annie thought about it, then shook her head. I can do it. Angela nodded once. Then I'm right here. Annie climbed the steps, holding the railing with one hand and her invitation with the other. When she reached the top, Richard stepped aside so the audience could see her name on the screen without him blocking it. Annie Brooks, recipient number 001. Annie looked at the words for a long second. Richard wondered if she was reading them or making sure they stayed. He picked up the certificate folder again, though she had already received it once. This time he started over. Annie Brooks, he said you were selected as the first recipient of the Bennett Future Scholars Fund because your teachers saw your work. Your application showed your effort and your name belonged on this list before anyone tried to move it. He handed the folder to her. Annie took it with both hands. Then she turned toward the audience. She did not smile for the cameras. She did not wave. She simply held the certificate against her chest with the ticket pressed flat on top of it. The room stood. Angela remained at the foot of the stage in her damp work shoes and hospital scrubs. She clapped with everyone else, but her eyes did not leave Annie. That was the picture Richard wished every camera could understand. Not a billionaire fixing a mistake. Not donors applauding generosity, but a mother watching her child's name be returned in public after someone had tried to erase it quietly. When the applause settled, Richard looked toward Tyler Grayson and his mother. Tyler stood beside his seat, uncertain, one hand gripping the back of the chair. David Grayson remained near the front row, arms folded, his expression hard enough to warn people away. Richard knew the next step mattered. If he ignored Tyler, the boy would carry shame that did not belong to him. If he softened the truth for David, Annie would hear it. Tyler, Richard said, would you come here for a moment? David straightened. No, he's had enough. Tyler's mother touched her husband's arm. Let him decide. Tyler looked at his mother, then at Richard, then at Annie. He walked slowly to the front of the stage, but did not climb up. Richard came down to meet him on the floor. You did nothing wrong tonight, Richard said, keeping his voice low enough that it was not a show, but clear enough for nearby tables to hear. Adults put you in a difficult place. I'm sorry for that, Tyler swallowed. I didn't know it was hers. I know. My dad said I was getting a special award. David's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Richard nodded. Then you were told something that wasn't complete. Tyler looked past Richard at Annie. I'm sorry. Annie blinked as if she had not expected those words from him. It's okay. Angela, still near the stage, said gently, baby, you don't have to make it okay. Annie looked at her, then back at Tyler. She corrected herself. Small but steady. Thank you for moving. Tyler nodded. That answer seemed to give him somewhere to stand. Richard turned slightly toward the room. We will not solve an adult failure by humiliating another child. Tyler Grayson will not receive Annie's scholarship because it was never his to receive, but he will leave this room with his dignity because he did not create this problem. Some people nodded. Tyler's mother pressed a hand to her son's shoulder. David Grayson finally spoke. And what exactly do you expect me to do, Richard? Sit here while you imply my family stole from a little girl. Richard faced him. I expect you to tell the truth about what you knew. A hush fell again, sharper than before. David's eyes narrowed. Careful. No, Angela said from below the stage, every head turned toward her. She did not step onto the stage. She did not need to. She stood in the aisle in her scrubs, tired from a hospital shift, one hand still carrying her work badge, and looked at David Grayson like she had looked at more than one arrogant doctor, billing clerk, or supervisor in her life. "Don't tell him to be careful," Angela said. "Careful is how people like my daughter end up outside. Everybody gets careful, nobody gets honest." David looked at her as if he had not expected her to speak. Angela continued, "Did you know your son wasn't on that original list?" David said nothing. Tyler turned toward him. "Dad," his wife whispered. "David." David looked around the room. The cameras were up again, though no one had moved closer. The donors he had expected to impress were now watching him with the same question. At last, he said, "I was told there might be a way to include Tyler," Richard asked. "By Clara." David's mouth tightened. "Yes." "Did you ask her to remove another child?" "No." "Did you ask whether all 12 seats were already filled?" David hesitated. "I assumed she had discretion." Angela gave a quiet laugh. "That's a soft word for taking." David flushed. "I did not take anything from your daughter." "No," Angela said, "you just didn't ask who was moved so your son could sit down." The sentence struck the room harder than anger would have. Richard let it stand. Then he said, "Mr. Grayson, our business discussions are suspended effective tonight. If your firm wants any future relationship with Bennett Global or this foundation, the first step will be a written statement confirming you did not fund, request, or authorize the removal of Annie Brooks. The second step will be cooperation with the review." David's face went rigid. "You're risking a great deal." Richard looked at Annie on the stage, then back at him. "No, I already found out what I was at risk of becoming." That ended the argument. David sat down slowly, not defeated, but contained. Tyler's mother guided Tyler back to their table. The boy looked smaller now without the borrowed importance adults had placed on him. Annie watched him go, then turned to Richard. "Is he still allowed to have cake?" she asked quietly. Richard paused. Angela closed her eyes for half a second. And Denise, standing nearby, almost laughed. "Yes," Richard said, "he is still allowed to have cake." Annie nodded as if that settled an important matter. The room released a breath it had been holding. Waiters began moving again, quietly clearing plates and refilling water. A few children whispered to one another. One of the scholarship recipients asked if they could still take the group picture. Richard looked at Annie and the others. "Only if all of you want to," he said. A boy near the middle of the stage raised his hand. "Can our parents be in it?" "That's a better idea," Richard said. The photographer, now careful, arranged. The 12 recipients with their families or guardians. Angela stood beside Annie, one hand resting lightly on her shoulder. Some children had both parents. Some had grandmothers, aunts, older brothers, teachers. The picture took longer than planned because no one wanted to rush it. This time, Richard stood at the edge, not in the center. Denise leaned toward him. "You're supposed to be in the middle." "No," he said, "the children are." She looked at him, then nodded. "That may be the smartest thing you've said tonight." After the photo, Richard returned to the microphone for the last time that evening. "I will not ask this room to forget what happened," he said. "Forgetting would make it too easy to repeat. Instead, I'm asking everyone here to remember what a name is. It is not a line on a spreadsheet. It is a child's mother checking a ticket before work. It is a teacher writing a recommendation after school. It is a child standing in a hallway, trusting adults to mean what they printed." He looked toward Annie's ticket. Justice does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it starts with checking the name one more time. Angela looked down at Annie. Annie was listening. Richard continued, "This foundation will continue, but after tonight, it will be built differently, more carefully, more honestly, and with one rule above all others. No partnership, no donation, no powerful last name will ever outweigh the child who earned the seat." The applause was not immediate. It came after people had time to take in the words. Richard preferred that. Fast applause was often relief. Slower applause meant something had reached the conscience first. As the evening began to close, Annie returned to her table with Angela. She broke the cookie in half and pushed one piece toward her mother. Angela picked it up. "You really saved me half." Annie nodded. "It was mine." Angela smiled then, small and tired. "Yes, baby, it was." Richard saw them from across the room and understood that the scholarship certificate mattered. The investigation mattered. Clara's removal mattered. But that half cookie kept by a child who had been asked to wait outside her own future mattered, too. It meant Annie still believed something could be shared without being taken. By the time the last guests began collecting their coats, the ballroom no longer looked like the place Annie had first seen through the crack in the door. The stage lights were lower. The banner still hung above the empty chairs, but the room had lost its polished certainty. People moved more slowly now, as if each of them had to step around what had happened. Angela kept Annie close, but did not hover. She had one hand on her daughter's chair while Annie finished the other half of the cookie, taking small bites as if saving it could make the evening last long enough to understand. Denise sat across from them with a folder open, writing notes in a careful hand. Richard approached with Meredith Shaw, the company attorney. He stopped before he reached the table. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, "may we sit?" Angela looked at Annie first. Annie nodded, so Angela did, too. Richard and Meredith sat down. Marcus remained near the door, not because anyone had asked him to, but because he seemed determined not to leave his post until Annie did. Meredith placed a packet on the table. "Mrs. Brooks, this is the preliminary scholarship confirmation. It states that Annie Brooks is the confirmed recipient number 1 of the Bennett Future Scholars Fund. It includes the award benefits, direct contact information for my office, and a temporary protection note stating that no changes can be made to Annie's award status without written consent from you and Mr. Bennett's review board." Angela did not touch the packet right away. "Temporary until the full board signs the revised policy tomorrow. Meredith said this protects Annie tonight." Angela picked it up and read the first page slowly. Richard respected that. She did not skim because a lawyer was waiting. She read because her child's future had already been mishandled once by people who expected trust to come cheap. Annie leaned against her mother's arm. "Is it like homework?" Angela kept reading. "More important." "Oh." Richard slid a second paper forward. "This is my direct office number, not the Pub Foundation line. If anything is unclear, you call this." Angela looked at the card, then at him. "You answer your own phone." "Not always," Richard admitted. "But after tonight, your calls will not be filtered through anyone who thinks your daughter is an inconvenience." Angela held his gaze. "Good answer." Denise smiled faintly. "That's high praise from Mrs. Brooks, I think." Angela almost smiled back. "It's a start." Annie tapped the certificate folder. "Mama, does this mean I get books?" Angela looked at the packet. "It says books, tutoring, reading program, summer learning, school supplies, and technology support." "A computer?" Richard nodded. "A laptop for school work. Not a toy." Annie sat a little straighter. "Can it have a writing program?" "It will." Angela looked at Richard. "She writes stories mostly about girls who build things." Annie corrected her. "Not mostly. Sometimes they fix things." Richard's expression softened. "That may be even better." Across the room, David Grayson was speaking sharply to his wife near the coat check. Tyler stood beside them, quiet, holding a small plate with cake on it. He looked toward Annie's table once, then looked away. Annie noticed. "Is Tyler in trouble with his dad?" Richard followed her gaze. "I don't know," he said. "Sorry, he did. He didn't write my name out." "No," Richard said, "he didn't." Angela touched Annie's shoulder. "That's why we don't put grown folks' wrongs on children." Annie thought about that. "But grown folks should know better." Angela gave a short, tired laugh. "That they should." Meredith closed her folder. "Mr. Bennett, legal has Clara's statement pending. She has declined to answer several questions until she has counsel." Richard nodded. "That is her right." Angela looked up. "She gets rights." "Yes," Richard said. Angela's face hardened. "My daughter had a ticket and got a hallway." "She did," Richard said. "And Clara will still get due process. If we skip that because we're angry, people like her use it to escape consequences." Angela stared at him for a moment, then gave a slow nod. "Fair enough. Justice has to be cleaner than the thing it's correcting." Richard repeated the sentence under his breath almost to himself. "Justice has to be cleaner." Annie looked between them. "What does that mean?" Angela answered before Richard could. "It means when somebody does wrong, we don't fix it by doing wrong back. We fix it right so it stays fixed." Annie nodded as if filing that away. A hotel manager approached carefully. "Mr. Bennett, we can arrange a private exit for Mrs. Brooks and Annie if they'd prefer." Richard looked at Angela. Angela looked at Annie. "Do you want to leave through the side door or the front?" Annie's eyes moved toward the ballroom entrance, the same doors that had kept her out. She was quiet for a moment. "The front," she said. Angela's hand tightened gently on hers. "You sure?" Annie nodded. "I came in the front." Richard understood at once. So did Angela. "The front, then," Richard said. Denise gathered the papers into a folder and handed it to Angela. Meredith placed her card inside. Richard picked up Annie's certificate, but Annie reached for it. "I can carry it," she said. He gave it to her. Of course. As they walked through the ballroom, a few guests stepped aside. No one crowded them. Mrs. Caldwell, the retired teacher, stood near the exit and gave Annie a small nod. "You have a good night, Miss Annie." Annie looked up. "Good night." At the front doors of the ballroom, Marcus was waiting. He stood straighter when Annie approached. "Miss Brooks," he said, "I owe you an apology." Annie stopped. Angela did, 2. Marcus removed his security cap and held it in both hands. I should have called your mother when the ticket and the list didn't match. I followed the sheet, but I should have followed up harder. Annie looked at her mother. Angela did not answer for her. Annie looked back at Marcus. You checked twice. I did, but twice wasn't enough. Annie thought about that, then said, next time, check 3. Marcus nodded seriously. Yes, ma'am. Next time I check 3. Richard saw the guard's eyes shine, though no tear fell. Angela saw it, too. At the lobby, the glass doors opened to the damp Atlanta night. Valet attendants moved between cars. City lights reflected in the wet pavement. Angela pulled Annie's little coat around her shoulders. Richard walked with them to the curb, stopping a respectful distance away while Denise arranged a car through the hotel. He did not offer his own limousine. After tonight, he understood that help had to be useful without making people feel owned. Angela noticed, you're learning. I'm trying. That matters if you keep doing it after the room is empty. I will. Annie looked at him. Mr. Bennett. Yes. Can I keep the old ticket? Richard glanced at the wrinkled invitation in her hand. It belongs to you, even though I have the big paper now. Especially because you have the big paper now. She looked at the ticket again. I want to remember they were wrong. Angela bent slightly. And what else? Annie thought that somebody checked. Richard felt those words more deeply than applause. The car pulled up. Angela opened the back door, then paused and turned to Richard. Tomorrow, when people start talking, they're going to talk about you, she said. Make them talk about the rule you changed instead. Richard nodded. I will. Angela helped Annie into the car. Annie placed the certificate on her lap and the ticket on top of it, smoothing the wrinkled paper with both hands. As the car pulled away, Richard stood beneath the hotel awning until the tail lights disappeared into traffic. Denise came beside him. The board is going to call before sunrise. I know David Grayson will too. I know. And the press will want a statement. Richard looked back through the glass doors at the ballroom where staff were taking down the banner that had promised 12 seats while one child stood outside. Then give them one sentence, he said. Denise waited. Richard said every child's name will be checked before any adult's title is honored. Denise typed it into her phone. Inside, the hotel staff began stacking the 12 white chairs. Richard watched until the last one was lifted, and he made a decision he did not yet announce. Next year, there would still be 12 seats, but there would also be someone at the door whose only job was to make sure no child stood outside holding proof that nobody bothered to believe. The next morning, Richard arrived at Bennett Global before most of the city had finished its first cup of coffee. Atlanta was still gray at the edges, the office towers reflecting a pale sky, traffic beginning to thicken along Peachtree Street. In the lobby, the security guard greeted him with the usual. Good morning, Mr. Bennett. But Richard heard it differently now. Names mattered more after you had watched one nearly disappear. By 7:15, the boardroom was full. Some directors had joined in person, others through screens along the wall. Denise sat to Richard's right with a folder of overnight press clippings. Meredith Shaw sat to his left with a legal memo. Peter Lang had not slept much. His tie was loose and a paper cup of black coffee sat untouched near his laptop. At the far end of the table, a board member named Charles Whitman cleared his throat before Richard had even taken his seat. Richard, before this becomes larger than it already is, I think we need to discuss containment. Richard set Annie's wrinkled invitation on the table. Nobody spoke for a second. This is what we failed to contain, he said. Charles glanced at the ticket. I understand the emotional weight of what happened. No, Richard said. You understand the public weight. That is not the same thing. Denise looked down, but Richard knew she agreed. Another board member, Patricia Lell, leaned forward. She was in her late 60s, a retired superintendent who had joined the foundation board because she believed scholarships should reach children before the world taught them to lower their hands. Let him speak, Charles. Richard opened the folder Meredith had prepared. At 5:14 yesterday evening, Clara Whitmore removed Annie Brooks from the recipient roster. At 5:17, she manually added Tyler Grayson. At 5:21, she reassigned the 12th seat. At 5:24, she exported the security roster that caused Annie to be stopped at the door. We also recovered an unsent email to Mrs. Brooks saying Annie's participation had been postponed due to duplication. Charles shifted in his chair. Has Clara admitted intent? She admitted enough before witnesses. She said the Grayson partnership would make expansion easier. A director on Green side that quote will be everywhere. It should be, Patricia said. It explains the whole thing. Charles frowned. With respect, Patricia, we cannot run a national foundation on outrage. Richard looked at him. We will not run it on favors either. Meredith slid copies of the proposed policy across the table. Effective immediately. We recommend a complete change. Control protocol. No recipient status can be altered after final approval without 3 signatures: the program director, legal counsel, and an independent child advocate. No changes within 48 hours of a ceremony except for documented emergency reasons. Security receives a verification method beyond printed rosters. Every child has a check-in advocate assigned by name. Parent or guardian contact must be attempted and documented if there is any mismatch. Patricia nodded. And the child waits where? Meredith looked at Richard. Richard answered, not in a hallway. If there is a question, the child is escorted to a supervised family reception area, offered food, water, and a phone call. The child is not treated like the problem. Good, Patricia said. Charles rubbed his forehead. All of this is sensible, but we also need to consider David Grayson. His office called mine at midnight. He claims he did not request Annie's removal. Then he can say that in writing, Richard said. He also says suspending business discussions is an overreaction. Richard rested his hand near Annie's ticket. David accepted a benefit without asking whose place his son had taken. You don't know that. I know he was told Tyler could be included. I know he did not ask whether a child was being displaced. I know when the truth came out. His first concern was embarrassment. Denise spoke. Then the public reaction is not as bad as you think. It is intense. But most people are focused on the fact that Richard corrected it in the room. Charles looked at her. Most people, a few are asking why Annie was there alone. Some are questioning her mother. Richard's face hardened. Then our statement protects Mrs. Brooks first. Denise nodded. Already drafted. Read it. Denise opened her notebook. The Bennett Future Scholars Fund confirms that Annie Brooks was a fully approved recipient and arrived with a valid invitation, confirmation code and parent contact information. Her mother, Angela Brooks, was working an emergency hospital shift and took appropriate steps to ensure her daughter's safe arrival. The failure was ours, not Mrs. Brooks's and not Annie's, Patricia said. Keep that line. Richard nodded. What else? Denise continued. The employee responsible for the unauthorized change has been removed from foundation duties and suspended pending formal review. All records have been preserved. The foundation is implementing new safeguards to ensure no child is ever denied entry because of an unverified roster change. We apologize to Annie Brooks and Angela Brooks and we will honor Annie's scholarship in full. Charles leaned back. It's blunt. It's true. Richard said. Truth does not always limit liability. Meredith answered before Richard could. Neither does sounding evasive. That ended the argument for the moment. Richard turned to Peter. Status on the other children. All 11 confirmed. No other unauthorized changes. I've sent direct confirmations to each parent or guardian. Copied legal and locked recipient status until the new protocol is active. And Annie's packet prepared, but I thought you might want to send it yourself. Richard looked at the clock. It was not yet 8. Angela would likely have slept very little after her shift in the ceremony if she had slept at all. He did not want to turn her mourning into another boardroom matter, but promises delayed too easily became promises softened. He stood. Send the statement at 9 o'clock. Meredith, continue the review. Denise set a meeting with Patricia for the child advocate role. Charles, if David Grayson calls again, send him to legal. Charles raised his eyebrows. That's all. No, Richard said, picking up Annie's invitation. Now, I'm going to deliver what my foundation should have protected before anyone touched a microphone. By 9:30, Richard was in the backseat of a black town car heading south through Atlanta. He had refused the longer limousine. It felt wrong for the morning. Denise came with him and so did a foundation program officer named Elaine Park who carried the official award packet, a laptop agreement, and a printed copy of the new protective note. Richard carried the ticket. Angela Brooks lived in a brick apartment building with faded blue railings and a narrow strip of grass along the sidewalk. A school bus stopped at the corner as they arrived. Children climbed aboard with backpacks bouncing against their shoulders. A woman in slippers waved from a balcony somewhere nearby. Bacon hissed in a pan and a dog barked twice before being called inside. Angela opened the door wearing a gray sweatshirt over her scrub pants. She looked tired but not unprepared. Annie stood behind her, dressed for school, her hair neatly parted, her certificate folder tucked under one arm. Richard stayed in the hallway. Good morning, Mrs. Brooks. We won't come in unless you invite us. Angela looked from him to Denise to Elaine Park. That's a better start than most people with papers. Richard accepted that we brought Annie's official packet and the written policy protections we discussed. Angela opened the door wider. 10 minutes. Annie still has school inside. The apartment was small and clean. A stack of library books sat on the coffee table. A lunchbox waited near the door. On the refrigerator, held by a magnet shaped like a peach, was a spelling test with a red star at the top. Elaine explained the award in plain language. Books, tutoring, summer reading camp, school supplies, transportation support, and a laptop issued through the program. Angela stopped her twice to ask questions, and Elaine answered without rushing. Annie listened from the couch, swinging her feet above the carpet. Does the laptop come today? Angela gave her a look. Annie. Richard smiled slightly. Not today, but soon. And it will have a writing program. Annie sat up. The one where you can make pages. Yes. Can I write about a girl who checks every door in a building? Angela closed her eyes and shook her head, but there was warmth in it. Lord, she already has a plot. Richard placed Annie's ticket on the table beside the new packet. The wrinkled paper looked fragile next to the clean folder. I brought this back, he said. I didn't want it left in some office file. Annie picked it up. I thought I kept it. You did. This is the scanned copy from last night. Printed for our records. I wanted you to see what I wrote on the back before it goes into the Foundation archive. She turned it over. In Richard's handwriting were the words, "Your name was always yours." Annie read it silently. Then she read it again. Angela did not speak for several seconds. When she did, her voice was quiet. That better not just be pretty writing. It won't be, Richard said. The board approved immediate safeguards this morning. Angela looked at Denise. In writing, Denise handed her the policy sheet. In writing, Angela read the first paragraph while standing beside the kitchen counter. Annie looked at Richard. Mr. Bennett. Yes. If another kid has a ticket and the list says no, what happens? Richard answered carefully. Because children remember rules better than adults expect, they get seated in a safe room with an adult assigned to help them. Someone calls their parent or guardian. Someone scans the ticket. No one changes their place unless 3 approved people sign and explain why. And no one leaves them standing outside. Annie considered that 3 checks. 3 checks. Mr. Marcus said next time he'd check 3. He'll be part of training security. Annie nodded, satisfied. Angela signed the receipt for the packet but kept her hand on the pen after she finished. I'm glad Annie has the scholarship. I am. But I want you to understand something. This is not the first time a child like mine gets told to wait while people with nicer shoes walk in. Richard did not answer quickly. Angela continued. Sometimes it's not loud. Nobody says the ugly thing out loud. They just say policy list later. Not today. Come back with your mother. And if the mother is working, that becomes the child's fault, too. Richard looked at Annie's school shoes lying neatly near the door. I understand more than I did yesterday. Angela studied him. That's honest. Don't say you understand all of it. I don't. Good. Annie slipped the copied ticket into her certificate folder. Mama, can I take it to school? Angela hesitated. Not the original. The copy. Angela looked at Richard. Will that cause trouble? Richard said only for anyone who thinks her name should be hidden. Angela almost smiled. Then take the copy at the door. Richard paused. Mrs. Brooks, the Foundation would like to invite you and Annie to help us design the new check-in process. Paid consulting time, not a favor. Your experience has value. Angela raised one eyebrow. You want to pay me to tell rich people how not to lose children? Denise answered, honestly, yes. Angela looked at Annie, then back at Richard. Send me the details. I'll read them after work. That's fair. As Richard stepped into the hallway, Annie called after him. Mr. Bennett. He turned. When I write my story, can I make the girl open the door herself? Richard looked at the copied ticket in her folder, then at the mother standing behind her. Yes, he said, but let somebody be smart enough to check her name when she gets there. Annie nodded. That part, too. Richard walked back to the car with Denise beside him. Outside the school bus had gone and the street had settled into morning. His phone was already full of messages from board members, reporters, and David Grayson's office. He did not open them yet. For once, the most important business of the day had not happened in a tower, a boardroom, or a ballroom. It had happened in a small apartment where a mother read every line before signing, and a child learned that a name once moved could be written back stronger. By the end of that week, Annie's name had traveled farther than Richard intended. It moved through local news segments, school district newsletters, hospital break rooms, church Facebook pages, and the quiet conversations people had while waiting for coffee after Sunday service. Some called it a heartwarming correction. Some called it a scandal. Angela called it what it was. They tried to trade my child's seat, she told Richard over the phone. And now everybody wants to make it sound softer because softer is easier to sleep with. Richard did not argue. The Foundation issued its statement. Meredith preserved the records. Clara Whitmore hired an attorney and declined further comment. David Grayson's company released a carefully worded note saying they had not requested any child be removed, but they remained concerned by the public handling of a sensitive matter. Denise read that sentence aloud in Richard's office and made a face. Concerned by the public handling, she said, "That is Rich." Richard stood by the window overlooking downtown Atlanta. He's concerned he got seen. He also wants a private meeting. No. Denise looked up. That was quick. He can speak to legal. He says he'll withdraw from future partnership discussions. Richard turned from the window. Then he finally found a door he can close himself. Denise closed the folder. You know the board won't love that answer. The board approved the fund to help children, not to flatter donors. That's what you'll say. That's what I'll mean. The cost came in pieces after that. A regional sponsor paused its commitment. 2 donors asked whether Richard had overreacted emotionally. A business columnist wrote that billionaires should not make policy in anger. But for every complaint, another letter arrived. A retired teacher from Savannah sent a check for $25 and a note that said, "For the child at the door." A nurse from Augusta wrote that Angela Brooks reminded her of every mother who had ever worked through a school program she wanted to attend. A grandfather mailed a handwritten letter saying he had once been the boy with the wrong shoes and had never forgotten the teacher who said his name correctly. Richard kept those letters in a folder labeled Door Notes. Denise teased him for the name until she read the grandfather's letter. Then she stopped teasing. The foundation changed faster than anyone expected. Patricia Lell agreed to serve as independent child advocate. Marcus Hill was invited to help rewrite event security training. He arrived at the first planning meeting in a pressed shirt, looking uncomfortable in the boardroom. "I'm not sure I belong at this table," he said. Angela, who had come straight from an early shift, still wearing her hospital badge, looked at him across the conference table. "Mr. Hill, you were the door. You belong." Marcus nodded once and that settled it. They built the new check-in policy line by line. No child would be left alone at an entrance because of a list mismatch. No roster change could be made without written approval from 3 separate authorities. Every event would have a child advocate at the front door, not backstage, not on call, but standing where the children arrived. Parent contact numbers would be checked before the event began. If a child came without a parent because that parent worked, served, drove, cleaned, nursed, cooked, or could not leave a shift, the child would not be treated as less protected. Angela read every page. Sometimes she crossed out words. "Unaccompanied minor sounds like airport trouble," she said during one meeting. "Right, invited child arriving without guardian present." The attorney blinked. "That's longer. It's truer." Richard looked at Meredith. "Use Angela's wording." Annie came to one meeting after school and sat beside her mother with a library book open. She seemed to be reading. But when Patricia suggested that children with unresolved status be escorted to a holding area, Annie looked up. "Don't call it that," she said. Patricia turned gently. "What would you call it?" Annie thought for a moment. "A welcome table." The room went quiet in the good way. Angela smiled faintly. "Put that in." They did. 3 weeks later, Bennett Future Scholars held a small training session at the same hotel. No chandeliers this time, no press, just staff, volunteers, security, and folding chairs arranged in a meeting room that smelled of coffee and dry erase markers. Richard asked Marcus to speak first. Marcus stood at the front, hands clasped behind his back. "When a list and a child disagree," he said, "you do not start by doubting the child. You start by checking the list." A woman from event staff raised her hand. "What if the ticket looks wrong?" "Then you check 3 ways," Marcus said. "Ticket system, parent contact. And while you check, the child sits at the welcome table with an adult whose only job is to help. Nobody waits outside a door." Annie sat in the back with Angela, swinging her feet under the chair. Richard saw her listening, not proud exactly, serious as if she understood that the rule had been built from a bruise and therefore had to hold. After the training, Richard walked them to the lobby. The Magnolia Grand looked the same as it had that night. Marble floor, brass fixtures, fresh flowers near the desk, but Annie did not look toward the ballroom doors with the same uncertainty. She looked at them like a place she had already measured. Angela noticed. "You all right?" Annie nodded. "They should put the welcome table right there." She pointed near the entrance where guests naturally arrived before reaching the ballroom hallway. Richard followed her finger. "You're right." Angela looked at him. "You going to write that down, too?" Richard took out his phone. "I'm learning." Annie smiled a little. "Mama says grown-ups learn slow." Angela sighed. "Annie." Richard typed the note. "Your mother is not wrong." A month passed. Annie began her reading program. The laptop arrived in a plain box delivered to the school instead of made into a photo opportunity. Angela signed for it in the principal's office after checking the equipment sheet twice. Annie named the laptop page, which Richard only learned because Ella Park mentioned it during a program update. "She's writing." Elaine said a lot. "What about a girl who checks doors?" Richard smiled at that. He did not visit Annie often. Angela had been clear about boundaries, and Richard respected them. The scholarship was support, not ownership. Still, once in a while, he received a note through the program office, a reading progress report. A thank you card from Annie's class after a book shipment. A photocopied page Annie had written titled, "The list was wrong." It began, "The door did not know me, but my ticket did." Richard kept that page in the door notes folder. Late in the spring, Bennett Global's board met again to review the foundation's future. This time, the room felt different, the same table, the same coffee service. Some of the same doubts, but the new policies had been adopted, and donations had not collapsed. In fact, smaller donors had increased. Teachers' unions, church groups, retired nurses, and neighborhood associations had begun sending modest gifts with notes. The money was less glamorous than a corporate partnership, but it came with fewer strings. Charles Whitman flipped through the report. Grassroots donations are up 31%. Patricia Lowell looked over her glasses. Funny thing about ordinary people, they like it when children aren't traded for business deals. Charles ignored the tone. The Grayson partnership is dead. Richard nodded. Then bury it. Denise coughed to hide a laugh. Charles looked at Richard. I'll admit the public trust numbers recovered faster than expected. Richard leaned back. That was never the main measure. No, Patricia said, but it helps when doing right doesn't ruin you. Richard looked at the report, at the list of new applicants, at the policy page with Annie's phrase printed in bold. Welcome table protocol. He thought of that night in the hallway. Annie holding the ticket. Clara saying partnership. Angela saying, promises sound better with signatures. Marcus saying, check 3. We expand next year, Richard said. But not to 5 states. We start with Atlanta and 2 surrounding counties slowly enough to know every child's name. Charles opened his mouth, then closed it. Patricia smiled. That summer, Angela and Annie came to the foundation office to review the final design for the next ceremony. Annie wore yellow sneakers and carried a notebook with stickers on the cover. Richard met them in the conference room where a mock layout of the new event space had been printed on poster board. This is the entrance, Denise explained. This is the welcome table. This is the family seating area. This is where recipients check in. Annie leaned over the board. Where do kids go if their parent is parking? Elaine Park answered to the welcome table. If the list is wrong, welcome table. If somebody important says hurry up, Marcus, who had joined by video from the hotel security office, answered from the screen. Still the welcome table. Annie nodded satisfied. Okay. Richard watched her place a small blue sticker on the entrance area. What is that for? So they see it first, Annie said. Before the stage, Richard looked at the sticker. It was shaped like a star. Angela folded her arms. She's been waiting to put that somewhere all morning. It belongs there, Richard said. Annie looked at him. Mr. Bennett. Yes. Next time if a kid forgets their ticket but knows their name, can they still check? Richard glanced at Elaine, then Marcus, then Patricia. All 3 understood. Yes, Richard said. A ticket helps, but a child's name is where we start. Annie wrote that in her notebook. Angela leaned toward Richard. Careful, she'll hold you to every word. I'm counting on it. The next ceremony was still months away. But as Richard looked at the poster board, he understood that the story had already moved beyond 1 child and 1 stolen chair. Clara had tried to make Annie's name smaller than a deal. Instead, Annie's name had become part of the rules, not a slogan, not a photo, a safeguard. And in Richard's world, where contracts shaped buildings and signatures moved millions, that meant something real had finally been built. By the time the second Bennett Future Scholar ceremony arrived, the event no longer belonged to the kind of ballroom that made children whisper. Richard had moved it to the Auburn Avenue Public Library, a brick building with wide front steps, old oak trees near the sidewalk, and a children's room that smelled faintly of paper, crayons, and floor wax. Angela approved of the change the moment she saw the layout. At least here, she said, looking through the glass doors. A child knows books are supposed to be for them. Richard stood beside her with the event folder in his hand. That was the idea. Angela gave him a side glance. Whose idea? He pointed toward Annie. Annie was near the entrance wearing a blue cardigan over a yellow dress and the same yellow sneakers she had worn to the planning meeting. Her hair was pulled back with a ribbon and her notebook was tucked under one arm. Around her neck hung a small volunteer badge that said Annie Brooks, Student, Welcome Helper. She had asked for that title herself. Not guest, not speaker. Helper. At the front entrance, the new welcome table stood exactly where Annie had placed the blue star sticker months earlier. The sign was simple, printed in large letters. Welcome table. Every name matters. There were no velvet ropes. No long hallway between the door and the children. No guard standing like a final answer. Marcus Hill stood near the table in a navy suit instead of a security jacket, greeting families as they came in. Patricia Lell sat behind the check-in list with a tablet, paper copies, backup contact sheets, pens, water bottles, crackers, and a basket of small library bookmarks. Denise had insisted the table look organized. Angela had insisted it look human, water where they can reach it. Angela had said during setup, not behind somebody important. So, the water sat at the front. Families began arriving before 10 o'clock. A grandmother with 2 boys from East Point. A father in a mechanic's shirt wiping his hands on a clean towel before signing the check-in sheet. A mother still wearing a grocery store name tag. A teacher who brought one of her students because the student's aunt had to work. Every child was greeted by name. And when a name took time to find, no one frowned at the child. Marcus would say, "Give us a second, sweetheart. Lists like to act smarter than they are." Annie liked that line. She wrote it in her notebook. Richard watched from a distance. He did not stand at the table unless needed. That too had been Angela's advice. If you stand there in your good suit, she had told him. Some parents will think they're being judged before they even get inside. So Richard stayed near the main reading room, helping move chairs when volunteers needed him. A few donors arrived and looked mildly confused by the absence of a private reception area. Denise handled them with a smile. "Coffee is by the community room," she said. "Families first today." At 10:30, a little boy in a red hoodie stopped near the entrance with a folded paper clutched in one hand. He stood apart from the line, not trying to leave, not trying to enter. Annie saw him before any adult did. She walked over, careful not to crowd him. "Hi, are you here for the scholarship ceremony?" The boy looked at his shoes. "Maybe that's okay. Maybe is enough to check." She pointed to her badge. "I help at the welcome table." "What's your name?" "Luis Ramirez." Annie turned toward Patricia. "Miss Lell, can we check Luis Ramirez?" Patricia typed the name. Her brow tightened for half a second, then smoothed. "I have Luis R. from Garden Hills Elementary." The boy lifted his head. "That's me." "Good," Annie said. "You're on the list." Luis did not move. Annie recognized that pause. It was not confusion. It was the moment before a child trusts a door. "My aunt said, if they didn't find me, I should wait outside," he said. Annie looked through the glass doors toward the front steps, then back at him. "No, you wait here." At the welcome table, Marcus leaned slightly toward Luis. "And if anything is wrong, we check 3 ways." Luis looked at Annie. "What if it's still wrong?" "Then we call your aunt," Annie said. "But we don't lose you." The boy held on to the paper for another moment, then stepped closer to the table. Richard saw Angela watching from near the bookshelves. Her face did not change much, but she nodded once as if a promise had just passed inspection. When the ceremony began, the community room was full, but not crowded. Children sat in the first 2 rows with their families beside them, not behind them. Teachers sat wherever they were needed. The donors sat farther back and seemed better for it. On the wall behind the small podium was a banner, smaller than last year's, with 12 blue stars and the names of the recipients printed clearly beneath them. Richard opened the ceremony but briefly. He had learned that the more adults explained their goodness, the less room children had to be seen. "Last year," he said, "this foundation learned a hard lesson. A child's name is not a detail. It is a promise. Today, before we celebrate scholarships, I want to thank the people who helped us build a better door." He turned toward the welcome table. Mrs. Angela Brooks, Marcus Hill, Patricia Lell, Denise Bennett, Elaine Park, and Annie Brooks. The room applauded. Annie did not look away this time. She stood beside her mother, holding her notebook against her chest. Angela leaned down. "You all right?" "Yes, ma'am." "You want to speak?" Annie nodded. "I wrote it down." Angela smiled. "Then read what you wrote." Richard stepped aside as Annie came to the podium. She had to stand on a small step so she could reach the microphone. Last year that might have made people soften their faces in pity. This year they simply waited. Annie opened her notebook. "Last year," she began, "I had a ticket but I was outside. I thought maybe the ticket was wrong. Then I thought maybe I was wrong." The room stayed still. "My mama told me I did not go there to beg. She said I went because I was invited." Mr. Bennett checked my name. Mr. Marcus learned to check 3 times. Miss Patricia helped make the rules. Miss Denise put the welcome table where kids can see it. My mama read all the papers. Soft laughter moved through the room. Angela folded her arms, but her eyes warmed. Annie continued, "This year, if a kid comes to the door, we don't start by saying no. We start by saying, 'What is your name?' Then we check. If the list is wrong, we fix the list. We don't fix the kid." Richard lowered his eyes. He had heard speeches from governors, CEOs, university presidents, and pastors. None had said the purpose of justice more plainly. Annie turned one page. I still have my old ticket. She pulled it from the pocket of her cardigan. It had been laminated now, the wrinkles sealed inside like proof that paper could survive being mishandled. On the back, Mr. Bennett wrote, your name was always yours. I keep it because I want to remember two things. They were wrong. And somebody checked. She looked up then, not at Richard, but at the 12 children seated in front. So, if you are here today, your name matters. If you feel little, your name matters. If your mama is at work, your name matters. If your shoes are old, your name matters. If somebody important is in a hurry, your name still matters. Angela pressed a hand to her mouth. Annie closed her notebook. Last year, I stood outside with a ticket. This year, I get to open the door. The applause came slowly at first, then rose until the room stood. Annie did not rush away from it. She stepped down from the small platform and returned to her mother, who bent and kissed the top of her head. Richard walked back to the podium after the room settled. For a moment, he could not speak. Denise, seated near the sidewall, mouthed, "Don't ruin it." He almost smiled. He looked at the 12 children. Then, let's begin the right way. One by one, the recipients were called. Luis Ramirez was third. When his name sounded through the room, his aunt, who had arrived late from work, stood in the back doorway in her restaurant uniform and clapped with both hands over her head. Louise turned and grinned. Annie, standing near the welcome table, gave him a thumbs up. Each child walked forward. Each name was checked before it was spoken. Each certificate was handed to the child with the family beside them. No one was rushed. No one was treated like a favor. After the ceremony, there was lemonade, cookies, fruit, and chicken salad sandwiches from a local deli Angela liked. Donors spoke with teachers. Parents spoke with program officers. Children wandered toward the shelves and came back with books. The library staff had set out a cart labeled "Take One Home," and by noon, it was nearly empty. Richard found Annie near the front doors, helping Louise choose a bookmark. "Stars are dinosaurs?" Louise asked. "Dinosaurs," Annie said. "Stars are nice, but dinosaurs look like they know where they're going." Louise accepted this logic and took the dinosaur bookmark. When he left with his aunt, Annie watched him go through the front doors. This time, the doors were open from the inside. Richard stood beside her. "You did well today." Annie looked at the welcome table. Nobody waited outside. No, not even when the list was slow. No, she nodded. Then it worked. Angela joined them, carrying Annie's notebook and a plate with 2 cookies wrapped in a napkin. "Ready to go?" Annie looked at Richard. "Can the welcome table stay next year?" "It will, and the year after." "Yes, and when you're too old." Angela sighed. "Annie." Richard laughed softly. "Especially then. We'll put it in the bylaws." Annie looked at her mother. "That means papers." Angela nodded. "Important papers." "Good," Annie said. Outside, the afternoon sun lay across Auburn Avenue, bright on the library steps. Families walked to cars, bus stops, and the nearby MARTR station. Angela took Annie's hand, and together they started down the steps. Halfway down, Annie stopped and looked back at the glass doors. Richard followed her gaze. The welcome table was visible inside, blue sign still standing, volunteers still packing slowly around it. On the table, the basket of bookmarks sat beside the roster and the water bottles, ordinary things arranged with care. Annie lifted her laminated ticket once, not to show him, but as if reminding herself. Then she tucked it safely into her pocket and walked on with her mother. Richard remained at the top of the steps. Denise came beside him, holding the final attendance report. "All 12 checked in," she said. "No mismatches unresolved. 2 parent calls made. 1 late aunt located. 0 children outside." Richard took the report. "That last number is the only one I care about." Denise looked out at Annie and Angela crossing the sidewalk. "You know, last year this fund launched with a scandal." "No," Richard said. "Last year it launched with a correction." Denise considered that, then nodded. Inside the library, a volunteer turned off the microphone. Chairs scraped softly as people began stacking them. The banner came down, but the welcome table remained until the last child left. Richard watched Annie climb into her mother's car with her notebook, her certificate, and the ticket that no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. Some stories do not end when the wrong is exposed. They end when the rule changes. When the door stays open, when the child who was once left outside becomes the one who notices who is missing. And from that year on, at every Bennett Future Scholar ceremony, before speeches, before "What is your name?" Then they checked and they opened the door. The lesson of this story is that justice often begins with one person willing to stop, look closer, and ask the question everyone else avoided. Annie did not need pity. She needed someone to believe the truth in her hands. Her ticket was more than paper. It was proof that her name mattered, her place mattered, and no child should ever be pushed aside to make room for power, money, or convenience. True kindness is not just giving opportunities. It is protecting them when someone tries to take them away. The story reminds us that every child deserves to be seen, heard, and welcomed through the door that was promised to them. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration.